Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our second read in Chapter 2 entitled Urban Facts and Fallacies. Today we're going to be reading the subsection entitled Housing. Before we do, just wanted to remind everybody that this is being done as a parallel read as per your request with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. As with every one of these reads, so I'll link to that series in this video's description. As with all of these reads, I'll also be doing an analysis and review section at the end of the video, so I've time-stamped the beginning of the analysis and review section of this video in this video's description as well. So if you want to just jump ahead to the analysis and review, you can go ahead and do that. So real quick before we get started, this is going to be a very, very long read. So the analysis and review is going to be something I'm going to try to keep fairly short. So without further ado, let's dive into Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our second read in Chapter 2, Urban Facts and Fallacies, which is the subsection Housing. The biggest economic fallacy about housing is that, quote-unquote, affordable housing requires government intervention in the housing market, perhaps with subsidies, rent control, or other devices to allow people with moderate or low incomes to be able to have a decent place to live without paying ruinous prices for homes or apartments. Ruinous prices for housing are certainly a fact of life in some places, leaving people of moderate or low incomes with inadequate amounts of money for other things. The question is whether government programs offer a way out of such situations for most people. The idea that government intervention improves the situation is a notion which has been repeated innumerable times in many ways, but endless repetition is not a coherent argument, much less proof. When we turn from political rhetoric to hard facts, we find that those facts tell a story directly opposite to what is being said in politics and in much of the media. It is precisely government intervention in housing markets which has made previously affordable housing unaffordable. Both the history and the economics of housing show this. History. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, before government intervention became pervasive in housing markets, we find people paying a smaller percentage of their incomes for housing than at the end of that century. Even though real incomes at the beginning of the 20th century were only a fraction of what they were at the end, a small percentage of those smaller incomes was sufficient to cover housing costs. Back then, the rule of thumb was that housing costs, whether rents or mortgage payments, should not take more than 1/4 of a person's income. In 1901, housing costs took 23% of the average American's income. By 2003, it took 33% of a far larger income. In California, where government interventions in housing markets have been especially pervasive, the proportion of income required for housing has increased even more steeply in an even shorter span of time. Quote, most people know that the San Francisco Bay Area is one of the most expensive housing markets in the nation. However, not everyone realizes that, as recently as 1970, Bay Area housing was as affordable as housing in many other parts of the country. Data from the 1970 census shows that a median income Bay Area family could dedicate 1/4 of their income to housing and pay off their mortgage on a medium-priced home in just 13 years. By 1980, a family had to spend 40% of their income to pay off a home mortgage in 30 years. Today, it requires 50%. End quote. In Salinas, California, about 100 miles south of San Francisco, the median price of a home required 60% of the median family income in 2006. A real estate agent in that area reported selling a 1,013 square foot house more than 50 years old to an immigrant farm worker for $490,000, with a monthly mortgage payment that took 70% of his pay. Nevertheless, the buyer, whose family had lived for years in a rented room, quote, was so thrilled that he cried when he signed the loan, end quote. 3/4 of the land in the country is legally blocked from development. With such a severe restriction in supply, high land prices were virtually guaranteed, and therefore also high prices for the housing built on that land. It is not uncommon in California for the land to cost far more than the housing that is built on. The housing that is built on it. History can be looked at another way in terms of when pervasive government regulation of housing markets began and when housing prices skyrocketed. Since these were mostly state and local regulations, the beginnings of stringent housing regulations have varied somewhat from community to community. By and large, however, the decade of the 1970s marked the beginning of severe government restrictions on the building of houses and apartments. That same decade marked the meteoric rise of housing prices in those places where the restrictions were particularly severe, such as coastal California. While many cities and counties in California, Oregon, Hawaii, and Vermont created restrictive housing laws and policies during the 1970s, many other places did not, or did so at different times. Housing price rises reflected those differences. An economic study of housing prices concluded, quote, in most cases, the decade in which housing markets became unaffordable closely followed the approval of state growth management laws or restrictive local plans, end quote. The same high correlation between government intervention and sharply rising housing costs can be found in other countries as well, where housing restrictions are particularly severe, under a variety of politically attractive names such as open space laws or quote-unquote smart growth policies. An international study of 26 urban areas with quote-unquote severely unaffordable housing found 23 of those 26 to have strong smart growth policies. The results belie the phrase. Restrictions on the building of homes and apartment buildings take many forms. Smart growth laws restrict the expansion of home building in suburban areas. There are also quote-unquote open space laws, which simply forbid the building of anything on land set aside in various areas. 40% of the land in Montgomery County, Maryland, for example, more than 2/3 of the land in San Mateo County, California, and, as already noted, 3/4 of the land in Monterey County, California. Although a typical middle-class single-family home is usually built on a quarter-acre lot, minimum lot size laws forbid the building of homes on less than an acre of land in some places, or several acres of land in others. Then there are zoning laws, environmental laws, historic preservation laws, and others, including arbitrary limits on the number of building permits issued and or requirements that builders conform to whatever arbitrary preferences and preconditions members of planning commissions choose to impose before issuing permits. Contrasts in housing prices are sharp between places that have numerous or severe restrictions and places that do not. Houston, Texas, for example, does not even have zoning laws, much less the array of severe housing restrictions found in some other cities. A nationwide real estate firm estimated that a typical middle-class home on a quarter-acre lot that costs $152,000 in Houston would cost more than $300,000 in Portland, Oregon, $900,000 in Long Beach, California, and more than $1 million in San Francisco. At the beginning of the 21st century, home prices in Tampa and Tallahassee, Florida, were not very different from prices in Houston, but after restrictive home building laws passed in the late 20th century began to take effect, quote, housing prices in most Florida markets have at least doubled relative to Houston, end quote, according to a study just a few years later. Even in California, with its housing prices 3 times the national average, the situation was radically different before the crucial decade of the 1970s, when building restrictions proliferated. In the same San Mateo County, where home prices averaged more than $900,000 in 2005, a vast, privately built middle-class development called Foster City was built in the 1960s with home prices starting as low as $22,000, and with even waterfront homes on its lagoons being available for under $50,000. Even allowing for inflation during the intervening years does not account for the later escalation in home prices in Foster City. The Consumer Price Index showed approximately a five-fold increase in the general price level between the time when Foster City was built and the early 21st century. But the average home price in Foster City in 2005 exceeded $1 million, which is to say, the average price of a home in Foster City is now more than 20 times the price of an upscale home in the same community in the 1960s. In other words, even allowing for inflation, the real price of homes in Forest City has more than quadrupled. While it is hard to imagine that these historical patterns are just coincidences, correlation is not causation, so we need to consider the economics of the situation as well as the history and to scrutinize alternative explanations of these patterns. Economics. Many things can cause housing prices to rise, including anything that affects either supply or demand. Rising incomes and growing population obviously affect the demand for housing. Supply is affected to the extent that the land area is so built up that little land remains to build on a given area. The innumerable legal restrictions and bans on building also affect supply, as does the ease of delaying construction with environmental, aesthetic, or other objections raised by officials, non-governmental organizations, and individual citizens. Even when these objections are found to be groundless or otherwise overruled, delay in itself can cost millions of dollars when vast sums of borrowed money are financing a project and interest has to be paid on that money, regardless of whether the building is proceeding on schedule or is stalled by claims that take time to investigate or adjudicate. How do we know which of these factors is responsible in any given case? Only by examining each of these possibilities in each specific case. If population is growing rapidly in a given area, it might seem that this would tend to cause more demand for housing and therefore rising housing prices in that area. But neither supply nor demand by itself can explain prices, which are determined by the combined effects of the two. As one economic study pointed out, quote, the population of Las Vegas almost tripled between 1980 and 2000, but the real median housing price did not change, end quote. However, the average price of houses in Palo Alto, California nearly quadrupled in 1 decade without any increase in population at all. The difference is that severe building restrictions began in Palo Alto during that decade, the 1970s, but not in Las Vegas, where builders could simply construct new homes as the demand for housing increased. But not one new home was built in Palo Alto during the decade when its housing prices nearly quadrupled. A similar pattern showing housing prices affected more by building restrictions than by increased demand for housing was shown in New York City, where, quote, tens of thousands of new units were built in Manhattan during the 1950s, while prices remained flat, end quote. In later years, especially after severe building restrictions began in the 1970s, that all changed. Quote, in spite of skyrocketing prices, the housing stock has grown by less than 10% since 1980, end quote, in Manhattan, according to an article in an economics journal 25 years later. Moreover, the proportion of new housing units in buildings 20 stories tall and higher, which had been increasing in Manhattan from the beginning of the 20th century until 1970, suddenly reversed and began a decades-long decline. Height restrictions are among the many building restrictions, which can be imposed either directly or by allowing complaints by neighbors to initiate costly construction delays while these complaints are adjudicated before various authorities. Those who make such complaints pay little or no costs, even when their complaints turn out to be completely unfounded and cost millions of dollars in construction delays to builders and ultimately to those who buy or rent the housing that is being built. Height restrictions have both economic and social consequences. Since the cost of housing includes both construction costs and the cost of the land on which the housing is built, the taller an apartment building on a given plot of land, the lower the land cost per apartment. In places where the cost of land exceeds the cost of constructing housing, height restrictions can mean that much higher rents or condominium prices must be charged. If economic considerations would lead to the building of a 20-story apartment building, but local laws restrict the height of buildings to 10 stories, then twice as much land will be required to house the same number of people. Moreover, if a community cannot expand upward, then it must expand outward, leading to longer commutes to work, more highway congestion, and, almost inevitably, more highway fatalities. All that is in addition to higher rents. Income is another factor in housing prices. With or without population growth, rising incomes can lead to a rising demand for houses by people who would otherwise be living in apartments, and a rising demand for bigger or better houses by people otherwise living in more modest homes. To what extent does income growth explain housing prices in those places where those prices have skyrocketed? Prior to 1970, housing prices in California were much like housing prices in the rest of the country, even though California housing prices later rose to become 3 or more times housing prices in the country at large. Since this meteoric rise in California housing prices began in the 1970s, how did California income increases compare to national income increases during that decade? Income rose less sharply in California during that decade than in the country as a whole. Meanwhile, in Houston during the late 1970s, quote, average income surged well ahead of the rest of the U.S., end quote, but nevertheless Houston remained, quote, one of the 15 least expensive housing markets of the 319 U.S. regions examined by Coldwell Banker, end quote. As already noted, Houston does not even have zoning laws, much less the large array of housing restrictions found elsewhere. The city grew rapidly, but housing prices rose less than in the country as a whole. Adjusting for inflation, real housing prices in Houston in the early 21st century were found to be, quote, 15% below the 1980 peak, end quote. Unlike Houston, Dallas does have zoning laws, but their effect is more limited than in other communities where zoning is an instrument of severe building restrictions. Overall, Dallas, like Houston, quote, has had little in the way of growth management, end quote. The result? Quote, Dallas has consistently maintained family incomes about 10% above the U.S. average, while its housing prices are generally lower than the U.S. average, end quote. One of the obvious factors in the price of housing is the cost of constructing homes and apartment buildings. These construction costs can vary from place to place and from one time period to another, especially as people begin buying bigger and higher quality housing with more associated amenities such as garages and air conditioning. The question here is, how far does this factor go toward explaining housing prices in those communities where housing prices are some multiple of what they are in other communities? As already noted in Palo Alto, California, where home prices nearly quadrupled during the decade of the 1970s, there was not a single new home built during that decade, so this was simply a question of the same existing homes selling for far more than before, and obviously had nothing to do with construction costs, since there was no new construction. Many other communities with strikingly higher housing prices than the national average, and sharply rising housing prices as well, Boston, Boulder, San Diego, and San Francisco, for example, have likewise had severe limits on new construction, so that construction costs there cannot explain skyrocketing housing prices in these communities, since so little new construction was permitted. An economic study of 21 housing markets around the country found that, in 12 of these markets, the cost of housing exceeded the combined cost of construction and the land by no more than 10%. It was precisely in other communities with extremely high housing prices that these prices exceeded construction and land costs by more than 10%, as high as 33 to 50% in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. In Midtown Manhattan, the prices charged for condominiums have been double their construction and land costs. A New York Times story provided a glimpse of the market for condominiums in Manhattan. Quote, Catalin Shavely, a 30-year-old bedding designer in Manhattan, devotes her weekends to scanning the classifieds and attending open houses, searching for just the right one-bedroom apartment for less than $750,000. She can't find it. End quote. Where builders are allowed to construct homes and apartments without severe government restrictions, even growing populations and rising incomes do not cause housing prices to shoot up because the supply of newly constructed housing keeps up with the growing demand, as in Las Vegas or Houston. High profit margins over and above the cost of construction and land attract more builders who wish to share in these lucrative returns on investment in home building. This increased supply of new housing then drives prices back down or else prevents them from rising in the first place. There is little opportunity for housing prices to continue to greatly exceed construction and land costs in communities without severe restrictions on building or a monopolistic collusion among builders. Far from being a monopolistic industry that can maintain high profit margins by keeping out competing newcomers, the construction industry has more than 7,500 firms constructing multifamily homes and more than 138,000 firms constructing single-family homes. More than 100 firms constructing multifamily homes are headquartered in Manhattan alone. High profit margins in communities with high housing prices cannot be explained by monopoly in the private market, but by government-imposed restrictions on home building. Ironically, having created artificially high housing prices, government then often supplies token amounts of quote-unquote affordable housing to selected individuals or groups. Such selective generosity may be subsidized by taxpayers or by making it mandatory that private builders sell a certain percentage of their housing at prices below market as a precondition for approving building permits. These below-market prices may nevertheless be higher than those housing prices would be in the absence of building restrictions. Moreover, where these prices represent losses to the builders, these losses are made up by raising the prices of their other housing even higher. But such well-publicized programs perpetuate the belief that government intervention is the key to creating affordable housing, when in fact such intervention has often been a key factor in making housing unaffordable. Politics. How did the kind of building restrictions that send housing prices sky high get started in the first place and acquire such political momentum? Part of the answer is the heady but misleading concept of planning. What is called planning in political rhetoric is the government's suppression of other people's plans by superimposing on them a collective plan created by third parties, armed with the power of government and exempted from paying the costs that these collective plans impose on others. The desire to control what other people do, whether in housing or in other things, existed long before the sharp rise in housing prices, which began in some communities during the decade of the 1970s. What held in check the ability of government officials to micromanage housing markets were property rights recognized by state constitutions restricting state and local governments, and by the Constitution of the United States restricting what the federal government could do. However, court decisions over the years eroded property rights, which were increasingly regarded as simply private privileges of people who happened to be fortunate enough to own substantial property. These private privileges, then being seen as expendable for the greater public good, represented the plans of political authorities. The landmark court decision in the Petaluma case in 1975 opened the floodgates to a vast expansion of housing restrictions in communities where planning was in vogue. One of the ironic consequences of regarding property rights as simply benefits enjoyed by more fortunate people, rather than as fundamental checks on government power, was that affluent and wealthy communities could now restrict the ability of moderate income and low income people to move into their communities. and the normal course of events, a growing demand for housing leads not only to new housing being built on unoccupied land, but also to old communities being transformed as existing housing is torn down to make way for new homes and apartment buildings. Sometimes the housing torn down is replaced by larger or more upscale housing, gentrification. But often what happens is that luxurious homes on large lots or estates are bought up by developers and then torn down to be replaced by more numerous and less expensive homes or apartment buildings and smaller lots for sale or rent to more numerous people of more modest income. The overriding of property rights by judicial and political authorities means that such changes in affluent or wealthy communities have been resisted or forbidden by a wide range of housing restrictions, such as minimum lot size laws, historic preservation laws, open space laws, smart growth policies, and by the creation of planning commissions and environmental agencies armed with arbitrary powers to approve or disapprove applications to build, or the power to impose arbitrary and costly preconditions on the issuance of permits. In short, the erosion of property rights has allowed affluent and wealthy communities to keep out the people of moderate or low incomes and prevent the building of housing for ordinary people that would change the character of existing upscale communities. The high housing prices created by these restrictions do not have to be paid by people already living in these communities who either own their own homes outright or whose mortgages date from earlier times before the sharp rise in housing prices that these restrictions create. Therefore, newcomers would have to be at least as affluent as existing residents in order to afford the higher housing prices. Far from losing anything by housing restrictions, existing residents see the value of their property shoot up, and it is existing residents who vote on local housing restrictions that raise housing prices for newcomers. This asymmetrical process is made possible by judicial erosion of property rights. Where property rights prevail in a free market, housing circulates regularly among different classes of people. Harlem, for example, was a middle-class white community in the early 20th century, but in just one decade it became a working-class black community. Although the affluent and the rich, by definition, have more income and wealth per person than the average member of society, often the total purchasing power of a far larger number of people is enough to bid away luxury homes and estates, replacing them with middle-class or even working-class homes and apartment buildings, changing the composition of a whole community. Where an existing community consists of people in upscale homes on large estates, and there is a growing demand for housing in their area, some of the existing residents may find the offers made by developers to buy up their property too tempting to resist. Once that happens on a large scale, the remaining residents can find the community changing around them, not only as regards the kind of housing being built, but also as regards the kind of people who move in. Respect for property rights means that existing residents and potential newcomers compete for the same space on an equal basis in the marketplace, rather than in a political process in which only the existing residents can vote. While the existing residents may choose to believe that they have a right to, quote-unquote, protect their community against outsiders by using the power of government, the Constitution of the United States requires, quote, equal protection of the laws, end quote, to everyone, regardless of where they happen to live or how long they have lived there. Moreover, what existing residents choose to call our community is in fact not their community. Each resident owns only the private property in which that particular Each resident owns only the private property which that particular resident has paid for. Those existing residents who choose to sell to developers have just as much right to do so under the Constitution as those who prefer to keep the community as it is. Another crucial insulation from free market forces has been having the government take over vastly more surrounding land than any or all of the existing homeowners paid for in the name of open space. Where thousands of acres of land are taken off the market around an upscale community, That can mean millions or even billions of dollars worth of land being made unavailable to others for the benefit of the existing residents of that community. Local residents do not need to pay for that land, nor need the governmental unit that takes the land off the market. Merely by forbidding or restricting what can be built on that land, the government automatically lowers its market value, often drastically. At these artificially lower prices, various entities, private or governmental, can take over the land as open space at a fraction of what other people would be willing to pay for it as housing. In other words, the real value of the land as a resource which has alternative uses can be some multiple of that money, of the money that exchanges hands when governmental or private nonprofit organizations acquire it as open space. In Monterey County, California, which in 2006 had the least affordable housing in the nation, as measured by the percentage of the median family income required to make mortgage payments on the medium-priced home, existing residents were able to keep 3/4 of the land in the county off limits to development. In other words, the land that all the residents put together paid for as their private property was less. In other words, the land that all the residents put together paid for as their private property was less than 1/3 of the land that they controlled politically and barred other people from acquiring as private property. One of these residents, quoted by the Wall Street Journal, expressed an attitude common in such situations, whether in Monterey County or elsewhere. Quote, "Nobody wants to give up this way of life," says Carol Harrington, who lived in the Salinas area since her youth. "Wild turkeys, wild pigs, and deer roam on her 16 acres." End quote. Land use restrictions protecting this way of life have a cost paid by others, not only in housing prices in the county that take 60% of the median family income for mortgage payments, but also in the fact that 39% of the homes in the Salinas area had 1.5 people per room, while less than 1% of other U.S. homes are that crowded. In other words, the open space of some has entailed the overcrowding of others, as less affluent families have had to double up in a home or apartment built for one family, or else a whole family may have to live in one rented room in order to cope with artificially high housing prices. Often the character of a community includes a bucolic setting or expansive views of the surrounding area, which those who live there cherish. But they did not buy those settings or those views or pay to have them guaranteed to remain the same in perpetuity. Other people with other preferences have had the same rights under the Constitution, at least until courts begin to erode both property rights and the, quote, equal protection of the laws, end quote, prescribed by the 14th Amendment. Political authorities in various jurisdictions began to take advantage of that erosion of property rights to pass restrictive housing laws under a variety of politically attractive names, such as open space, smart growth, and the like. Such restrictions have been especially prevalent in overwhelmingly upscale liberal communities, such as those in coastal California, where concerns are often expressed for the poor, for minorities, and for children, all of whom are among those most often forced out of such communities by high housing prices. In San Francisco, for example, the black population declined substantially from 1970 to 2005, both as a proportion of the total population, from 13.4% to 6.5%, and absolutely, from 96,000 people to an estimated 47,000. Similar patterns of black population declines by the tens of thousands have been found in other coastal California communities, such as Los Angeles, Marin County, and Monterey. All of these have long been overwhelmingly upscale liberal communities with overwhelming government restrictions on the building of housing. Like low-income minorities, families with children have also been disproportionately forced out of such communities by sharply rising housing prices. Sharply declining school enrollments, from 15,000 to 9,000, caused several schools in Palo Alto to be closed within a few years, beginning during the decade of the 1970s, when that community's housing prices nearly quadrupled. Declining populations of children have likewise led to many school closings in San Francisco and San Mateo counties during the same decade and in later decades, even though the total population in those counties increased. All right, that concludes tonight's read. The next read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies will be our third read in Chapter 2, which will be the section entitled Urban Economic Activities under the chapter Urban Facts and Fallacies. So that will be our next read in that section. On to now the analysis and review of what we just read. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So the read itself was fairly long, and most of it was fairly self-evident, so I'm going to try to keep this review as short as possible and kind of look at things from a very 30,000-foot view from all of this. So the first thing I want to make very clear, because he only says it once, and it's the very first sentence of this fairly long read and never comes back to it. I want to make it very clear what the fallacy it is he's looking to debunk, and it's the very first sentence of the section on Chapter 23. The biggest economic fallacy about housing is that, quote unquote, affordable housing requires government intervention in the housing market. And then he lists a bunch of examples of where that's the case. And of course, the distinction he's making when he uses these scare quotes around affordable housing is the distinction between affordable housing, lowercase a, lowercase h, and affordable housing, uppercase A, uppercase H. So, and I've already made my opinions very clear on affordable housing. If it's lowercase, yeah, I love it. If it's just a company that's coming in to bring in apartments that are small one-bedroom apartments with very limited amenities and, kind of, boring carpet with really bare bones basic appliances, probably without central air, maybe without air conditioning altogether, and just baseboards for heat, and laminate countertops with linoleum in the bathroom, and in the kitchen. If we're talking about just something like that, love it, absolutely love it. Come to town. There's a lot of towns, especially in my area, that really need that kind of housing. Limited landscaping, boring appearance on the cosmetic appearance on the outside. Boring, plain white for everything on the walls on the inside too. And the difference between capital A, capital H housing, affordable housing, that would be governmentally subsidized housing, which I actually don't like, and it should be self-evident as to why that's the case here in this read. And I want to clarify the straw man response, the straw man version of the claim, because the claim was, like I said, the biggest economic fallacy about housing is that affordable housing requires governmental intervention in the housing market, which it obviously doesn't, and in fact, what it tends to do is make things more expensive. But the straw man would be something along the lines of, Sowell believes that the only reason that housing prices increase is because of governmental interference, and he actually rejects that fairly explicitly, makes that the fact that he's not making that argument fairly clear on page 27. Many things can cause housing prices to rise, including anything that affects either supply or demand, and then he goes on to list a few of those things. And what's really important is to understand what he's talking about when it comes to supply versus demand. So and I talked about how a lot of what he says is self-evidently true. Restrictions on housing, and here he focuses on the developmental side of housing, and he'll get into tenancy contracts later. But restrictions on housing cause shortages in supply, and rent subsidization, so the affordable housing distinction I just made, causes artificial excesses in demand. In both cases, they're artificial, and in both cases, the natural effect is for prices to increase. These are reflections, again, of the laws of supply and demand, and as laws, they are completely unavoidable, axiomatic truths. And we talked about the distinction between a law and a theory in our last read in Henry Hazlitt's Basic Economics. So I guess I'll have to put a link in this video's description to that read itself, so you guys can jump straight to the analysis and review to understand the distinction to be made between a law and a theory. And I'll just give you the TV Guide version. A law is a description of observable characteristics. So a law is just purely descriptive, and a theory is explanatory. So it tries to explain things you see in nature. It tries to explain observable characteristics of reality. In the case of something like the laws of thermodynamics, as metals and metalloids tend to increase in temperature without changes in state, the volume of the metal tends to increase. Those are unavoidable laws of thermodynamics. Einstein's theory of relativity is an explanation of what we see in nature and can change over time. In fact, his theory of gravity that you would derive from relativity is actually a refutation and somewhat of a contradiction of the Newtonian theory of gravity. So that's the distinction between a law and a theory. We went into much greater detail on that in our last read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so go ahead and check that out. The reason I bring this up is because what we now need to have is a conversation about the difference between proof and evidence. So similar to how a law is a description of observable characteristics and features of reality, and theory is an explanation of those theories, proof and evidence exist on that same dichotomy. Proof is a validation of a logically constrainable conclusion through logically constrained processes. So these would be through your mathematical processes and through the hard sciences. Evidence is validation of a claim based on the results of observation. So proofs are examples of deduction. That would be your strong form logic, and evidence is reserved for induction. Evidentiary standards, are reserved for induction or weak form logic. These two things tend to operate in opposite directions. So if you have the conclusion on one side, if we're going to look left to right, and I'll do this in reverse so you guys can see that. So if we're going to work left to right, proof tends to pre-exist the conclusion. Proof, when you have the claim, and we're going to use a proof to validate a claim, that means that the proof pre-exists the claim. Evidence comes from the claim. So evidence works in the opposite direction. So in the case of, for example, Einstein's theory of relativity, we don't need evidence to validate his claim. He's already provided the mathematical and a proof of his theory of relativity. And it's not really all that important to understand what his theory was, but one of the we'll get into the evidentiary standard for Einstein's theory of relativity versus not. And the same thing is true of Sowell's use of supply versus demand claims, which we're going to get into into a little bit of detail in just a minute here. When you suggest when you suggest that a price of something is going to increase because the demand for the thing has increased, that's an axiomatic truth. You don't need evidence to validate the claim. There's proof already. This X tends to artificially inflate demand, because as demand goes up, prices go up, which artificially inflates prices. So as long as that first statement is true, and in many cases it's obviously true, as people want more of a good or service, then the demand for the good or service will tend to increase, so the price will tend to increase as well. Some claims are not logically constrainable. Some require an evidentiary standard to be considered valid. For example, if the question is, did I say my cat was fat? I may have a cat. It might be fat. I might like fat jokes, and I might talk about my cat all the time, but none of that is actually going to validate the claim that I said my cat is fat. What you really would want in this case is video evidence of me saying my cat is fat. So in this case, what we would infer from what we've seen is that I said my cat is fat. You'd want a tweet, a screen grab of a tweet that says my cat is fat. There are obvious weaknesses to that because some of these things can be faked. There are obvious weaknesses to when you take this out to the broader scale, because one of the things you really need to do in the scientific processes when you're trying to find causation through induction, and that's the weakest way to do that, is that you have to have very strict control of independent variables. So for example, I'll use something very basic, is the quality of food at a restaurant, right? So in the case of the quality of food at a restaurant, number one, I can't prove that the quality of food is good, right? I might know the chef. I might like his cooking at home. do I like his cooking at the job at work? No, this is where I need to control for certain independent variables. For example, at home, he might have an unlimited supply of time and might take his sweet ass time making things at home, which is necessary for this particular dish. If I go to a restaurant one time, at the same Italian restaurant one time, and get a dish and don't like it, does that mean that the chef doesn't know what he's doing? Does that mean that I'm going to consider their cooking not good? Well, I probably shouldn't for a variety of reasons. And one of those is, what if the dish that's being served is fish? I don't like fish. So that's an independent variable that would need to be controlled. So don't serve me dishes that I don't already like. In that case, the reason I didn't like the dish was because it was fish, not because the cook doesn't know what he's doing, or not or it could be that the server in that case dropped the food on the ground and there's hair on the food, and that was a one-off. Which is why when you're using induction, when you're using weak form logic, when you're using validation by an evidentiary standard, you need massive sample sizes. So you need sample sizes that are a reflection of the population. So if I go back to that restaurant 4 or 5 times, and every single time I go there, every dish I get is just terrible. Now, I don't need to get all of the, say, 40 or so items that are on the menu cooked a variety of different ways. But if I get, say, 5 or 6, that's a pretty clear indicator that the chef isn't cooking to my standard. And I can just go ahead and say that, man, I'm not going to like anything I get there. So in that case, if you're using induction, you generally speaking need large sample sizes. So when you're trying to suss out the opinion of, say, of a community, when it comes to something like, does a community want a community center in its area? You can't do that by having one person say, yeah, I want a community center. You need to suss that out. And there's a lot of independent variables you need to control for. For example, researcher bias. For example, you can't just go out with an opinion survey and say, do you want a community center? Because how do you define a community center? Well, that's one of the independent variables that you need to control for, how people define a community center. So generally speaking, when you have that's why it's considered weak form logic, because there are a lot of weaknesses within that. You have to infer it. It's something that from a philosophical standpoint, you can't know for sure. We can know that if this is 1 and this is 2, if I add 1 and 2, I get 3. That's something that is true by virtue of proof. We can deduce that. We can know for certain that is the case. So when Sowell uses, for example, one example in certain cases, when he uses anecdotes to evidence the claims he's already proved, we actually don't need, when he compares San Francisco, something that happened in San Francisco to something that's happened in Houston, we don't need nearly as much independent variable control, and we only need to really make that one comparison, because the claim has already been proved by the proof. And the same thing is true with Einstein's theory of relativity. One of the things that Einstein's theory of relativity predicts is that light would tend to bend, if you will, around supermassive objects. Our sun is considered a supermassive object. Now, light does bend around it, and I'll get to why we know that in a minute, very, very slightly. So what you would do from Earth in order to evidence the already logically proved claim is you would need to have a full solar eclipse, and super high power telescopes to look right around the fringes of the sun in the broad light of day to see solar systems, star systems, and star clusters and stars that we shouldn't be able to see. So star systems that are technically behind the sun. It wasn't, unfortunately, until I think it was the early 90s. I can't give you an exact date, when an Australian observatory actually evidenced exactly what his theory predicted. And of course, the stars, excuse the pun, have to align in order to do that. You need a super high power telescope. You need a full solar eclipse to happen directly over that super high power telescope. You need it to happen during the broad light of day. You need absolutely crystal clear, perfect weather conditions, and you need zero atmospheric interference. And the observatory has to actually be like perfectly ready for this to happen, and it has to perfectly time out for all this to happen. The stars did finally align in order for us to create that experiment, and that happened. In the case of the theory of relativity, we only need that one anecdote. That one anecdote is sufficient evidence to say this happens in reality. And this is a huge distinction between proof and evidence. Proof of a thing doesn't necessarily mean the thing has to exist. Evidence gives validation to the claim that the thing exists in reality. So if something doesn't exist right now, it doesn't mean that it can't exist. It doesn't mean that you don't have the conditions for the thing to exist. So, for example, in the case of this is happening politically now, voter fraud. Just because there isn't voter fraud happening now doesn't mean that you shouldn't take certain steps to preclude it from happening, because the conditions aren't technically there for it, or it just simply hasn't happened. Because if you use the proof, voter fraud has there's a good reason to let's say with voter fraud, there's good reason to commit voter fraud, and there are almost no penalties for committing voter fraud, and it's very easy to actually go about doing. If that's the case, then the logical proof would be that you would expect under certain circumstances voter fraud to manifest. And just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not there. And just because we haven't seen voter fraud doesn't mean you should take measures that might prevent voter fraud. So I'm not going to make an argument as to whether or not that's the right thing to do. You guys can suss that out yourself, figure that out yourselves. But that's just an example of the difference between proof and evidence. So let me just review my notes here. Yeah, so Sowell's use of one example in certain cases or of anecdotes validates the claim because his claim is already proved logically. Did I get into interference? Yeah, so governmental interference causes housing prices to go up and quality to decline. He talks about the second half later. I actually went into great detail about the deduction of how governmental interference results in both lower quality housing and increased prices in my series, which I've mentioned before on interference. I'll link to that in this video's description. Okay, so that I think basically goes over everything that needs to be said in terms of an analysis from that section. Again, most of the content should be self-evident. As far as just a quick review, I wish that when he was refuting these fallacies that he claims are so pervasive, I wish he had actually, in this case, evidenced that people are making these claims. And he actually does a very good job of that in trickle-down theory and tax cuts for the rich. It's only... let me see how many pages this is. There's only 13 pages, and he spends the first half of this little pamphlet going over examples of how the left have basically invented the trickle-down theory and tax cuts for the rich, and he shows exactly where these statements have been made, and then he goes about refuting those statements. I wish he had done that. It's a bit of a nitpick. If you're at home and you're thinking about doing one of these, a very intellectually driven and highly evidence-based standard for an economic textbook like this. Like if you're trying to recreate basically a Thomas Sowell's economic facts and fallacies where he refutes certain fallacies, I think it would be better and more credible if you were to cite the actual making of the fallacy. In this case, I wouldn't need a ton of anecdotes. I would need just a handful to show that this is at least a somewhat pervasive or somewhat common claims that are being made about a somewhat commonly held fallacy. I understand that they are. It's obvious to me that they are. I think it would be better writing if he actually did that. Again, it's a nitpick. The chapter, everything he says in this section is 100% true. And in fact, I did actually follow up on one of his sources, and I will link to that in this video's description because it actually does a very good job of going into greater detail on one of the finer points that he brings up in this chapter. So go ahead and check that out. So that concludes our analysis and review, and we will see you in the next one. Good night, folks.